Hi everyone. I decided I wanted to try to make a shorter version of my last video on how to make carrier ships that launch fighters. This time I want to try to be as succinct as possible, so here goes. This right here is the fighter ship. If you want to make a carrier ship that launches fighters, I recommend making the fighter ship first. So right here, oops. Ally fighter. So in create, this here is variable mother2 equals global.mother. So I'll show you in the carrier ship that I'll just show you now. The mothership says mother equals ID. So the global variable.mother becomes the specific ID of this specific mothership. And that way in the create event, that mothership creates this ship, and as it creates this ship, this global variable mother, at the very moment when the mothership creates this ship, global variable mother equals the specific mothership that created this ship. So in the create event, mother2 equals the specific mothership that created this ship. So that's how this fighter ship knows who its mothership is. Payload equals 2. This ship can fire twice before it runs out of ammo. Then it has to go back to the carrier ship. Health. And some of these other variables aren't so important for what I'm going to talk about. There's a bit of code in this that I'm not going to mention because it's sort of some extra stuff you don't need. I'm going to go over the basics of how to make fighters that fly from motherships and attack and then go back to reload. And I have some other stuff in here, like making fighter ships spread out, stuff like that. And I may not go over all of that because I want to go over the basics of how to get this working quickly. So first of all, the fighter needs to know who it's going to chase. Variable chasing them equals instance nearest XY enemies. XY means the XY coordinates of wherever this fighter ship is. So whatever enemy is nearest this fighter ship. This enemy is a parent object. And so all enemy ships are either children or grandchildren of this object. And then after, let's see, if instance exists smart2, this is a carrier, an enemy mothership. Basically, smart2 is an enemy mothership. And so if instance exists smart2, chase carrier equals the instance nearest of the enemy mothership. So this is not necessary, but I have both chase and M for chasing the nearest enemy, and I have chase the nearest carrier. Basically, if two enemies are both close by and one of them's a carrier, it's going to favor chasing the carrier. This ship has priorities over what it attacks. So if the enemy mothership exists, chase carrier equals the nearest enemy mothership. Else, chase carrier just equals the same as chase enemy, which is the instance nearest enemy. This right here, if instance exists mother3, this is a really bad piece of coding here, but as I mentioned here, mother2 equals global variable mother. Really, this should say if instance exists mother2, if point distance mother2, but I very pointlessly made mother3 equal to mother2 and then put mother3 here instead. Really, if you did this, you should just put mother2, and then this line here really should not exist, but it wasn't a very good coding job of mine, but I made this when I was very brand new at programming. This is the mothership now. Now this variable, in this case mother3, is the specific mothership that made this fighter. And so if the distance to the mothership is less than 50, so if it's right next to the mothership, and if there are enemies, then payload equals 2. So basically, if the fighter is out of firepower, if it gets within 50 of the mothership, it's reloaded. This is something I ended up not using. This really is pointless. But basically, I was going to say once you get reloaded, then the ship you're chasing becomes chaseM.x, chaseM.y, basically the nearest enemy. And so I was going to say that first, when you're out of firepower, fly to the mothership to reload, but once you've flown to the mothership to reload, then you're going to chase the enemy again. But actually, I handled this differently, so I'm actually not going to use this. I'll show you what I did instead. I'll skip this because this is really about just making ships spread out. Basically, if fighters get too close to each other, they might sometimes spread out a bit. It's not super important. So here we go. This is basically what it determines how the fighter flies. So, so if instance exists, the mothership, I just need this because I refer to the distance to the mothership. If you don't have this, and then you refer to the distance to the mothership, and there's no mothership, then you just called a variable that does not exist and you crash your game. So if instance exists mother, just put that there because I refer to mother here. So if payload is greater than 1, so if you have firepower, and if there are enemies, and if the distance to your mothership is less than 1400, all this means is these fighters will not fly farther than 1400 away from their mothership. I've decided to really tie them to the mothership. There's a limit to how far away they'll fly. And if distance to the nearest enemy is less than 4800, basically they just won't even try to attack an enemy if the enemy is farther away than this amount. If all that's true, then direction carrier, dir carrier, that's the instance nearest enemy mothership, basically. Remember, chase carrier is the nearest enemy mothership. And dir, direction, the nearest enemy. So there's the point direction of the nearest mothership, point direction of the nearest enemy, and the impulse, and then Lx equals length directs x impulse dir, Ly length directs y impulse dir. Basically, length directs x, length directs y. These are going to be the x and y components of the vector. And so the actual length here is I believe it's tied to the specific length of the object. And so when you combine length direct x, length direct y in a vector, you should have a line, I believe, that's the same length of the object or somehow related to the length of the object, and a direction. So, you have two x and y for a vector, and then you'll have a line in a direction. And because it's tied to the length of the object, it has a finite length, and therefore I'm going to use this to apply a finite force. So you can see over here, same thing, LYC, LXC, C for carrier. So again, this is same thing except for the carrier. So this is for the instance nearest enemy. This vector points in the direction of the nearest enemy. This vector points in the direction of the nearest enemy mothership. So if you're farther than 50 from the enemy, I decided not to have these ships crash into the enemy. So once they're within 50 of the enemy, they stop going after the enemy. That's like close enough. And then if the distance to the nearest enemy mothership, so chase carrier enemy mothership, is less than 1,000, then if the speed of this mothership is not undefined, and again, phi speed x, phi speed y, so x coordinate of the phi speed of the mothership, enemy mothership, y coordinate of the phi speed of the enemy mothership. If it's not undefined, I put the if it's not undefined because I'm going to refer to the speed of the mothership. If it's not undefined, then physics apply force. So from the force goes from the x and y position of this fighter to LXC, LYC. So basically these are the x and y components of the vector, and therefore if you go from x to the x component of the vector in the direction of the enemy mothership, y, a force from the y to the y component of the vector, then what you have is a force that points in the direction of that enemy mothership. And because these lengths are, when you put these vectors together, it should be the length of the object. Therefore, no matter what the directions are, the total magnitude of the force should always be the same. And that should point towards the enemy mothership. However, I have added one more thing here, which actually makes the force not completely constant. And that is that I have also added the x component of the carrier's speed to the x component of the force. I've added the y component of the carrier's speed to the y component of the force I'm applying. So what that means is the force that makes this fighter go is not only in the direction pointing exactly where the enemy carrier is actually accounting for where the enemy carrier is going. It's accounting for the velocity. So it's actually going towards where the enemy carrier is going, not just directly where the enemy carrier is. That will help it chase the carrier more effective, kind of cut it off a bit where it's going, and it's going to help it aim, because this ship is going to fire exactly the direction where it's facing, and this way it's going to face not directly at the carrier, but face where the carrier is going, accounting for velocity. So it's going to be harder for the carrier to dodge the projectiles that are fired at it. As I mentioned, this is not going to be constant acceleration, because as the speed of the carrier increases, the force will increase, because you're adding the speed of the carrier to the force. It's not constant acceleration. There are other ways to do this that would be constant acceleration, but what I decided is that, in modern warfare like jet fighters, if the enemy plane is close and trying to dodge their attack, they often will pull more G's to try to make a sharp turn and get the other plane. So I think in modern warfare, planes don't fly with a constant G force. And so these fighters don't fly with a constant G force. So that's the decision I made. There are other ways, though, of making sure that the force is always constant if you want an always constant force. So anyway, if basically the enemy mothership is within 1,000, you fly towards where the enemy mothership is going. If the enemy mothership is not within 1,000, then check to see if just there's any enemy within 1,000, and then same thing, fly towards where that nearest enemy is, not just where it is, but accounting for where it's going. Again, this account for the enemy speed. So in this way this is set up, this fighter favors chasing the enemy mothership. If there's many enemies close by, it goes for the enemy mothership. But if the enemy mothership isn't close by, it just goes for the nearest enemy. And basically same thing here, apply the force. Else, if there is no enemy within 1,000, then it just goes towards the nearest enemy. But it goes towards the nearest enemy without accounting for the enemy's speed. So basically when it's close to the enemy, it lets the enemy's speed actually affect where it's going. So it's not just going where the enemy is, it's going where the enemy is going. But if the enemy is pretty far away, it just goes straight towards where the enemy is. And this stop variable, basically, if I want to have a certain cutscene where the ships stop moving, I can make stop equal to 0. And then if there's no nearby enemy, the fighter stops moving. So I might use that for a cutscene. And if there is, but normally stop would equal 1. And that might be strange calling it stop, but basically I use this variable to stop this ship sometimes for cutscenes. So that really affects how the fighter flies. And now let's look at that. Remember, this whole thing though only happens if I have payload. If I run out of my 2 shots, I have to go back to reload. So if I run out of payload, then this doesn't get called. Instead, if payload is less than 1, and I also put if instance exists mother, because I'm going to call the variable mother, check the distance, go towards the mother. So if mother doesn't exist, and I try to go towards my mothership, I'm calling a variable that does not exist, game crashes. So you don't want the game to crash just because your mothership got blown up. So only call this if the mothership exists. And in my case, I also said if the enemies exist, then it'll check if payload is less than 1, or if the distance to the mother is greater than 1,400, or if the distance to the nearest enemy is greater than 4,800. So basically, if you're out of ammo, you're going to go towards the mothership. Even if you have ammo, but you're more than this far away from the mothership, you're going to go towards the mothership because I've tied my fighters. They don't go farther than this from the mothership. Or if the nearest enemy is just really far away, I've decided to have my ships reload, go back to the mothership, reload. And it's not necessary, but I found that my motherships did a little bit better in battles when the fighters automatically went back to reload when the enemies were sufficiently far away. That way, when the enemies came closer, all the fighter ships were completely full on ammo. It just helped them. I found they did a little bit better this way. And so this code is very similar to what I read above. Direction, point direction. This points in the direction of the mothership. Impulse, constant impulse. Again, L, X, L, Y. So the X component and Y component of the vector that points towards the mothership. And then I can then use this to apply a constant force towards the mothership. And I just added this if variable. Basically, if it's within 25 of the mothership, it stops going towards the mothership. But if it's greater than 25 from the mothership, it's going towards the mothership. And don't forget, up here, if it gets within 50 of the mothership, it reloads. And then as soon as it has reloaded, let me go back here. As soon as it has reloaded, then it's going to call this again, because it's going to say, oh, I have payload greater than 1. Enemies exist. I'm not farther than this from the mothership because I just reloaded. And then assuming other enemies aren't this far away, then it's just going to go back to engaging the enemies. So this ship goes towards an enemy, fires twice, goes back towards the mothership, reloads, goes towards the enemy, fires twice, goes back towards the mothership, and reloads. If the HP gets below 0, it blows up. I added some particle effects, some fireworks, made it look cool. You'll see that later. And then, so this is what happens when it actually has to fire. So, if it has payload, it's not going to fire if there's no payload, right? So, but if it has payload is greater than 1, and if cooldown is less than 1, so every time it fires, cooldown becomes 20. I didn't want to just fire twice really fast. I want there to be some time between when it fires. Then with instance create layer, x plus length directs x, y plus length direct y. So basically, this will create my fireball, basically my projectile, right on the nose of this ship, right in front of the ship. It creates it. And then it's going to give this projectile a velocity. And physics apply local impulse. Now this is local impulse. So it appears to be applying an impulse in the negative y direction, which would basically be up. However, it's a local impulse. So it doesn't always just fly up. It flies up relative to the ship. So if the ship is facing down, it's going to shoot down. If the ship is facing up, it's going to shoot up. If the ship is facing to the side, it will apply this impulse to the side. It's a local impulse, so it will shoot in whatever direction the ship is facing. And then here we go. Phi rotation equals other phi rotation. Phi linear velocity x equals plus equals other phi linear velocity x. Same with y, phi linear velocity y plus equals other phi linear velocity y. So it gives an impulse in a direction up relative to the ship, but also it adds the ship's x velocity to the x velocity of this projectile. It adds the ship's y velocity to the y velocity of this projectile. So the projectile is launched a certain speed in relative to how fast the ship is going. So if the ship is still, the projectile goes a certain speed, but if the ship is going fast when it fires, the projectile will go faster. The projectile, the speed of the ship will be added to the projectile. And if the ship is flying backwards, then the projectile is going to move slower. So I think that works pretty well. These fighters I call them fighters, but they're functioning almost like bombers. And I think this works pretty well. And when it fires, payload goes, -1. So as soon payload runs out, it has to reload. There's a cooldown. And I ended up not using this. Let's see. I really don't need this. This whole line of code I could just X out. This was my other plan of that, when payload gets less than 1, the chase ship X equals mother 3.x. So basically this would make it chase the mother instead of chase the enemy. And so, but I handled it differently. Instead, if payload is more than 1, then it's going to chase the either enemy carrier or instance nearest enemy. And if payload is less than 1, it's going to chase the mother. So I did it here. I did a very similar thing, but I did it up here. So this just doesn't do anything. So that's the fighter ship. So let's look at the mothership. Mother equals ID. So remember when the fighter is created, the ID, but when the fighter is created, let's go here. Mother2 equals the ID of the mothership that created it. Because at the very instance this fighter is created, global variable mother equals the ID of the mothership that created it. Mother equals ID. I'll skip this. It usually just attacks, it usually just flies towards the nearest enemy, but I'm able to give it a kill command to have it fly towards something else. Screen wrap. I'll skip the screen wrap, but basically if it goes off the screen, it can, well, actually, it's not really a wrap anymore. I think I changed it. Yes, it's not even really a screen wrap anymore. It was a screen wrap, but I modified it. So now it just gets pushed back on screen. If instance exists enemies, it flies towards the nearest enemy. So, I went over this code with the fighter, same with the carrier, except it's not really accounting for the speed of the enemy. It just flies towards where the enemy is. It's not really accounting for the enemy's speed. HP, if it gets low, there's a bunch of fireworks, explosions, some screen shake. And then here's how it makes the fighter ships. Create event, N2 equals 6. That will determine how many ships it makes. Every time it makes a ship, N2 equals N2 minus 1. So each time it instance create layer ally fighter, and you can just leave it here. You don't need this. This is unnecessary, but I have chosen to, when it creates a fighter, it actually launches the fighter with an impulse towards the enemy. So this can add a little bit of flair. Maybe it looks a little bit cool to have the fighter actually launch towards the enemy. It makes very little difference, honestly, but if you want to add a little flair or have it, you can do this to have the fighter launch, or you can just have this, just create the fighter. And so you don't really need this, but you could have, basically want to decide if fighters get destroyed, do you want to recreate fighters or not? And so you might just choose to have when the fighters are destroyed, there's no fighters and the carrier is helpless. Or you can have the carrier recreate fighters. It's up to you. So yeah, one more thing I'll point out here, because I haven't really talked about how do you control which direction the fighters face or which direction the carriers face. And I did this in a very simple way. The center of mass is up here. That means if I apply a force in that direction, the ship will face that direction. If I apply a force in that direction, the ship will face that direction because the center of mass is in front of the ship. So that's how I can actually control which direction the ship faces. It's really simple. Also, how I generally control which direction the carrier faces, very simple. And don't forget, this fighter will shoot in whatever direction it's facing because it applies a relative impulse to the projectile it makes. And so it faces towards not just where the nearest enemy is, but where the nearest enemy is going. And it will, that's the direction it goes, and it faces the direction it goes, and it shoots the direction it faces. So this is actually able to aim at moving objects and hit moving objects. And I think it works pretty well. So let's run this. So this is my game, and these are the carrier ships and the fighters being launched. I ran this in VM mode, and maybe I shouldn't have. It seems a little bit choppy, a little smoother the other way, but anyway. Here it goes. So there's a battle. My guys are being ambushed by an overwhelming force, and in the first level, your job is just to run away and get the message out so that people know what happened. Okay. Now let's see. Let's see how these ships fire. Okay. So they kind of aim. You can still dodge. But they do. Oh, I'm probably. Oh, okay. And there you have it. Here, I'll just die. So there you go. Making carrier ships that launch fighters. So if you're interested in the game you just saw, this game has been completed. It's now available on itch.io. So I'll put a link to this at below this video. So I hope that helps. Thank you for watching.